Hey everybody, welcome back to Write With Me, live screenwriting from scratch. Today is day 17, and we're going to incorporate the research into what we've been doing. Let's see, what do I call this thing? We're going to apply research to the story. Applying research. That's what we'll call it. Okay, for those of you in the chat, welcome everybody. It's kind of a ritual at this point for me to welcome an empty room. It's kind of funny. All right. Let's see. So, for those of you who are new, welcome to Live Screenwriting, The Ballad of Garvin Hackett, a movie script being written completely from scratch. So, the log line is The Ballad of Garvin Hackett is an ironic, darkly comic take on 90s action movies. It's Forrest Gump meets Scarface, directed by Sidney Lumet, and I'm going to put here, instead of accept, changing the log line. So the laws of physics actually apply. Sidney Lumet is a much more grounded director, in my opinion, than directors like Michael Bay, who are more, how would you describe them? Visually rich, let's call it that. So instead of going the traditional development route, I'm writing this movie in public, directly for you to visualize as a cinematic graphic novel. And so grab a notebook or a keyboard and write along with me. I'm going to change this public directly for you to visualize for you, and I'll put here to visualize later. I think that makes more sense. Okay. So instead of going the traditional development route, I'm writing this movie in public directly for you to visualize later as a cinematic graphic novel. There you go. So grab a notebook or a keyboard and write along with me. If you want to follow along from the beginning, check out the Liminal Boundaries Channel. You'll find the link in the description down below. Okay, so with that said, let's get started. Let's see. So where were we? Just to catch you up a little bit, we were in doing research, specifically on Whitey Jackson. So our main character, Garvin Hackett, is kind of like a low intelligence, not very verbal guy. Father gets killed, he wants revenge. Ends up in prison, meets Whitey Jackson, who's the guy who actually killed his father, but he killed him by mistake. Whitey puts two and two together and has an idea. I'm going to train Garvin to take out the rival gang, who he was trying to take out anyway. And that's how I accidentally killed Garvin's dad. And so that's sort of the backstory on Whitey Jackson. He becomes Garvin's mentor, so to speak, teaches him how to kill people and such. And then once Garvin goes back out into the real world, Garvin is actually really, really good at killing people. It's like his hidden skill. He discovers his talent. So we've cut Whitey. So the story takes place largely in 1994 in Overtown. 1994 in South Florida. Whitey is from Overtown. So it's a very interesting history there. And we did a bunch of research in the last episode, which I highly recommend you check out. Really interesting stuff, the history of Overtown and Liberty City, and the creation of I-95, which I didn't know about. It's kind of neat. And also the riots, the Miami riots. So the way that I conceptualized Whitey's character is he's a career criminal, but he grew up in Overtown, and he grew up in that Overtown Liberty City area, and he started going to jail. And once he gets out of jail, there's a riot. So it's almost like this riot to jail pipeline for him, where he comes out, and so his version of the world is this world with lots of riots in it, because in the 10 years or so that he's in prison, give or take, for each of his offenses, they kind of sequence almost perfectly where when he gets out, there's a riot. So, and that's sort of a backstory for him that would be kind of fun. to have a character that he's got a warped vision of reality because he grows up in a hyper violent place, and then he discovers, oh, every time he gets, he goes to prison, every time he gets out of prison, he just sees this violence on the streets and like mayhem, and then he does something and he goes back to prison. So his version of the world outside is completely different from what yours and mine might be. All right. So the one thing that we haven't done is look into George G.M. James. So I met a guy and he gave me this book by George G.M. James. I'll never forget the guy's name, the author, because it basically claimed that the Egyptian pyramids were built by black people. He was like a black nationalist. And I thought, I've never met anybody like him since. Or maybe I have. I had never met anybody like him before. And so it was a memorable thing talking to this guy. And so I remember I read the book and I thought, this is a little bit conspiracy weirdness and probably historically inaccurate. But when I thought of Whitey Jackson, I'm like, man, that would be really interesting if that was like his philosophy, because this guy's he really believed this. He was sharing this with me because he thought he had discovered this deep historical insight. And so he's sort of misguided. And I think that's kind of an interesting dimension. I remember I was on a plane and there was one guy I met. He didn't talk much at the beginning, but after a little bit, he started opening up. He was a big guy, big imposing guy. And he started opening up, and it turns out he worked security. And when he opened up a little bit, he started talking about his inner life and his beliefs. And wow, were his ideas crazy. And it was really interesting because he seems so normal, right, when you're sitting next to him. But then as you start talking, you see the world model come out. And the funny thing about these world models that a lot of people carry around their head, aside from how distorted they are, is how inconsistent they are to the facts. So I think that would be just the kind of misguided character would read George G.M. James. So I might be misguided. Let's do some research on George G.M. James. This is the last bit of research before we start synthesizing the last 3 research sessions, which is Garvin's mom, Roger Gust, and Whitey Jackson. I think Roger Gust and Whitey Jackson haven't been fully synthesized. So we'll go through all the character sheets and we'll figure out, and all the story sheets, and figure out where all this stuff actually belongs. And then once we do the police stuff, which is the last bit of research I think we need to get an outline, I think we can just go ahead and start doing our feature outline, which would be a lot of fun, because that's where sort of the rubber hits the road, where we take all the character sheets and all the story sheets and we synthesize them into our feature, and then we can start layering in some details. By that point, we'll have a treatment. Okay, so my guess is that once we have the outline, just again for reference, the reason we have the outline after this, after we finish all the character and story sheets to our satisfaction, we'll turn them into an outline, and then the next step after that is then we'll know, like with that outline, we'll sort of see the whole story. And then we'll know where we need to do additional research. We'll do that additional research. And once that research is done, that'll influence our story and our outline. And once that's done, we can just write the script. And that's going to be a lot of fun. That'll get us to a first draft. But since we'll have like a deep knowledge of the characters, we'll be able to really understand a lot more about them. Okay. So let's go into George G.M. James, because this is the most interesting sort of aspect for Whitey Jackson. It's kind of his inner life. Let's go to Gemini and let's hit this. Hey Gemini, so I remember when I was younger, somebody exposed me to a book by an author, George G.M. James, that claimed that the pyramids in Egypt were actually built by black people and that it had been covered up. Can you tell me more about George G.M. James, his publications, and his worldview? Let's see what Gemini says. George G.M. James is a prominent figure in the history of Afrocentric thought. His ideas have sparked a lot of discussion and plenty of debate over the decades. Here's a breakdown of who he was, his most famous work, and the worldview behind his writing. His name. Who was George J.M. James? George Granville Mona James. Interesting name. Was a Guyanese-born historian, author, and professor. He was highly educated, earning degrees from Durham University in England and later studying at Columbia University in New York. I wonder, like, can you see the bias here? He was highly educated. You wouldn't say that about, most people, you would just say he earned a degree from Durham University. You wouldn't say he was highly educated. Interesting. This must be from the source, right? That they're pulling, because they got a Medium post here. He spent much of his career teaching in the United States at historically black colleges and universities, including Livingstone College in North Carolina and Arkansas's A.M.N. College. He was a professor of Greek, Latin, and philosophy, which directly influenced his research. That's cool. His major publication, Stolen Legacy. I think this might be the one. While James wrote various articles, he is famous for one massive influential book published the year he died, Stolen Legacy. The Greeks were not the authors of Greek philosophy, but the people of North Africa, commonly called the Egyptian mystery system. In Stolen Legacy, James put forward a few central dramatic arguments. The stolen philosophy. He argues that what the world calls Greek philosophy, the ideas of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, was actually stolen from the Egyptian mystery system. The role of Alexander the Great. He claimed that when Alexander the Great invaded Egypt, he looted the great libraries like the one at Alexandria, and that Aristotle used these stolen texts to claim the ideas as his own. Very interesting. I don't really know my history that well, because I don't know like how Alexander the Great and Aristotle, like what was the timeline there. The identity of the Egyptians. James asserted that the ancient Egyptians were black Africans, and therefore the foundational intellectual achievements of Western civilization actually belonged to black people. That's what I remember. Regarding the pyramids, while your memory of his work linking black Africans to Egypt's grand architecture is spot on with his theme, James' book actually focused much more heavily on intellectual property, philosophy, mathematics, and science, rather than the physical construction of the pyramids themselves. However, because he argued that ancient Egypt was a black civilization, his followers naturally applied the conclusion to the pyramids and all of Egyptian history. His worldview. To understand James, you have to look at the time he was writing. In the early 20th century, mainstream Eurocentric history routinely dismissed, minimized, or entirely ignored African history and intelligence. James' worldview was a direct, radical pushback against that bias. His goals were to restore pride. Well, that's interesting when you have a historian trying to restore pride. He sounds more like an activist than a historian to me. And I would say that about any historian. He wanted to give people of African descent, a sense of historical pride and dismantle the myth of African intellectual inferiority. Challenge the status quo. He wanted to force the academic world to acknowledge the profound influence Egypt had on the Mediterranean world, including Greece. Now, I think most historians, that's what they aspire to, right? Is to rewrite history in a sense and get consensus from other people through their interpretation. The academic consensus. Today, historians and classicists view Stolen Legacy with a mix of respect for its cultural impact and deep skepticism for its historical accuracy. Respect for cultural impact, and so it's inaccurate but influential. You see the issue there? Yeah. Like, imagine if you said that about like Mein Kampf, right? I wonder if they would say that about Mein Kampf. Oh. Or the Communist Manifesto, which gets a lot of passes. Okay. Where modern scholars agree with James. The mainstream history now openly acknowledges that ancient Greeks borrowed heavily from Egyptian art, architecture, math, and culture. Egypt was a massive superpower that influenced everyone around it. Fair enough. Where scholars disagree, most historians point out significant factual error in James's timeline. For example, the Library of Alexandria wasn't built until after Alexander the Great died. Well, it was called Alexandria, right? So Aristotle couldn't have looted it. Furthermore, modern linguistics and genetics show that ancient Egyptian culture was distinct from Greek philosophy rather than a direct copy-paste. Okay. That makes no sense. Furthermore, modern linguistics and genetics show that ancient Egyptian culture was distinct from Greek philosophy rather than a direct copy-paste. Okay, this is crazy. All right. Despite the academic critic, because Egyptian culture was distinct has nothing to do with genetics. That's a lineage issue. Okay. Despite the academic criticism, Stolen Legacy remains a foundational text in Afrocentric studies and continues to be widely read and debated today. Interesting. So it's still like a main text. I'm going to copy this. And then I'm going to move it to Claude. Claude is generally a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to paste this. I'm going to say, hey, Claude, I pasted here above the response that Gemini gave me about the work of George G.M. James, but I'm a little bit suspicious about some of its phrasing and some of its sources. Can you do a little bit of analysis on this and give me a sense of like how much of what George G.M. James wrote has been largely discredited and how much, if any, has been historically, let's say, innovative and adopted into mainstream thought? I don't really care for this initial query on people's value for its cultural impact, because if it's inaccurate and it had broad cultural impact, that would be a negative cultural impact, which we'll get to in a second. But first I want to just focus on the veracity. How much of his claims, if any, have been supported by evidence? All right, it's going to be interesting. Now, Claude takes a while. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to do a quick analysis to see. I really want to understand how misguided George G.M. James was, if at all. Maybe he was onto something. But assuming he was, I want whatever he thought that was inaccurate, that was very, how do you say, emotionally true, but in actuality false. I think that's where Whitey's internal life will go, because he's got resentment, he's got bitterness, and so this kind of history is very, it gives him sort of a sense of pride, right? It gives him like sort of an emotional foundation, which is kind of sad if the emotional foundation is false. So, I mean, you can take something good and something bad from everything. So, man, it's taking a while. Well, while he's doing that, let's go to writing, and let's just go to Whitey's character, because we have a lot of stuff that we pulled in. Okay. Glades. Glades is the perfect narrative setting. So this is the prison, known to inmates as the Muck. Glades was an old, brutal farm prison right off Lake Okeechobee. It was notorious for its sweltering heat, lack of air conditioning, and violent yard politics. Okay. So that's the location, Glades Prison. Okay. We got to do a little bit of research to see what the full name is and everything. Let's see. Oh, I have such good stuff. Okay. Okay, Whitey Jackson is careless. Whitey Michael Jackson is careless but ruthless. He's a black supremacist. I think the term they call is ethnocentrist is what they used. I think it's a nicer word. I get the feeling. Actually, that's funny. Maybe he should use it. I'm an ethnocentrist. Or as he insists. An ethnocentrist. That's good. We got some dialogue there. He'll make a mistake and then just through sheer ruthlessness correct it. Okay, he'll make the mistake usually from carelessness, and then just through sheer ruthlessness correct it. That's sort of his, actually that's really his game, his strategy right there. Game strategy. Okay. Sloppy and ruthless shortcut taker. He'll make a mistake, usually from carelessness, and then just through sheer ruthlessness correct it. Yep, cool. I like that. All right, so we don't need this anymore. Down here. Okay. Okay, yeah, I got that book, his book, the book about the Egyptians being black, George G.M. James. I got to look into that. That's pending. Okay. I'm gonna put here ideology. Let's try that. George G.M. James, Acolyte. Okay. Still on Legacy, maybe? I can't believe this guy was teaching this stuff. I wonder how much historical. I mean, think about the bombshell. If the Greeks actually did take their ideas from the Egyptians, and then the Egyptians were actually, sub-Saharan Africans, that would be pretty intense. Okay. He's perpetually late. Yep. That's good to know. Okay. We're just going to put perpetually late. Okay. Okay. Why he's called Whitey? He's very black. He's very dark, let's just say. He's very dark. They used to joke he was the blackest guy in Overtown, so they called him Whitey. Okay. Okay. And we'll move that up. Okay. Police pull Whitey over for something stupid like a turn signal. Yeah, like no turn signal. And look in the trunk. Sees the evidence of the explosives and the crime, but focus instead. Would ignore that. Focus instead on a bag of weed. And that's how he gets pinched. Okay. Maybe he's smoking a blunt. And drinking some Colt 45. A blunt at the time, 1991. Yeah, there's a timeline. That's what I wanted to put into the... Where should I put this timeline? Maybe under his... Not the outline. Maybe under story A. It's going to be 1991. Ballad of Revenge. Yeah, so 1991, Miami. Whitey Jackson, a button man for Joe Slim, the Vanta gang accidentally blows up the car of an innocent accountant, James Robert Hackett, while trying to kill the leader of the rival Booby Boys gang. James Robert's son, unemployed Garvin, doesn't know who killed his father. The vows revenge. Okay. And then escalation 2 in prison. Whitey Jackson convinces Garvin that the Booby Boys actually killed his dad and offered to train Garvin so he can avenge his father's death. So 1994. Oh, so we got some timeline here. I actually figured that out on the last research, so do your research, children. Let's see. All right. I'll get my timer going. All right. So let's see. Go back to Whitey. What we got? Right. After killing Garvin's His dad. He gets arrested. He has an outstanding parole violation. Yeah, it's a parole violation. So they give him a few years. Okay. No turn signal. Wow. Okay. Okay, cool. So it turns out there was no tasers. So hit with a nightstick. Gets stiffened and dives. So this is actually funnier. So I don't know if you've ever watched like UFC fights, but some people when they get knocked out, they just go. So it used to be he was hit with a taser, but I found out that in 1991 there were no tasers, at least not the handheld ones. So face first into the ground. Whitey gets brought down by a $2 bag of weed and a Colt 45. That's Whitey in one scene. Okay. Okay. That's a good good quote. I wonder who should say it. Maybe Joel? That's a quote. Okay. Joel tells Jackson Garvin is doing his job for him. Yeah. When Whitey is in jail. Okay. This is funny. He gets uncomfortable that Joel likes Garvin so much. Which is kind of historically funny or relevant because of the Cubans and the blacks. They had a bit of a competition for jobs in South Florida when the wave of immigrants hit. This would probably be, wow, in the 90s. Yeah, it's a big wave in 94. That's a big wave of immigrants because those were economic immigrants more than political refugees. That wave of Cubans. Very interesting. Okay. Okay, this is good. Okay, at the massacre, Whitey. Okay. I wonder if he's into coke. It'd be kind of funny if he was into coke, because then he would do the Scarface, you know. But when did they do Scarface? When did the movie come out? I'd have to look that up. All right. So, neighborhood public housing, the pork and beans. Okay. I'm gonna bring this up. Let's do a little. So he was born in 1958. Makes him in his mid 30s. Like 60, 34. In 1994. So his late 20s when he kills Garvin's dad. Maybe 30 years old. Okay, cool. So we have a little bit of synthesis here. Let's see what Claude is up to. I think we have the potential for a response here. Let's take a look at it. The scholarly assessment of James is fairly stable ground, but let me verify a few specific factual points, including some of the exact phrasing that the Gemini response you're suspicious of before I give you the veracity breakdown. Useful. I've already caught one clear factual error in the Gemini text. I figured there was at least one or two. Let me check the origins of the mystery system concept and the current state of ancient Egypt ancestry question. It would be even more crazy if Whitey was white. If he was right, then that would be insane, because then everyone is wrong and he's right, and that would be kind of even more hilarious. And also it'd be kind of educational for me if that's. Let's look at the history of Egypt. Now, the one genuinely evolving piece, the ancestry question, where I want current data rather than my training knowledge. Okay, good. I've got enough to give you a straight veracity assessment, and I caught a couple of errors in the Gemini text along the way. Let me separate the two things you're asking. What's been discredited and what, if anything, survives as legitimate? Cool. The bottom line. The distinctive load-bearing claims of stolen legacy, the ones that are actually James's argument, are discredited. The claims that survive scrutiny were neither original to James or as strong as he stated them. So the honest answer to how much has been supported by evidence is almost none of the parts that made the book famous, and the parts that were true were already known before he wrote. Here's the breakdown. The discredited core. The Egyptian mystery system itself is a fiction. This is the most important thing Gemini left out entirely, and it collapses the whole book. James's central premise is that Egypt ran a systematic philosophical school, a mystery system with a curriculum that the Greeks studied and stole. But there's no Egyptian evidence for such an institution. The concept is traceable to an 18th century French novel. The belief in an Egyptian mystery system has its origins in a now forgotten but once widely influential book of fiction, Sethos, a Bildungsroman by the Sethos, a Bildungsroman by the Abbe Jean Terrasson, first published in 1731. That's a mouthful. Terrasson was a professor of Greek who had no access to Egyptian sources. He relied for his description of Egypt on Greek and Latin literature. The hieroglyphics couldn't even be read until the 1820s or 30s. His invented rituals were then absorbed into Freemasonry, and James, himself a Prince Hall Freemason, took them from there. His principal cited sources was Charles H. Vale's The Ancient Mysteries and Modern Masonry, 1909. So the foundation of the book is a back projection from a novel laundered through Masonic ritual. That's why classicists, historians, and philosophers across the board, Wilson J. Moses, Mary Lefkowitz, Ronald H. Fritz, Robert Todd Carroll, classify it as pseudo-history. Interesting, pseudo-history. The Aristotle-Alexandria theft mechanism is chronologically impossible. This is the one error Gemini did flag correctly. James claims Alexander looted the Library of Alexandria, and Aristotle repackaged the stolen Egyptian texts as his own work. But the library was founded under the Ptolemies after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. Aristotle died in 322 BCE, and Aristotle never went to Egypt. The mechanism by which the theft supposedly happened can't have occurred. James was, by his own text, dead serious about this. The Sacred Texts edition notes he even exhorts readers to boycott Greek letter fraternities over it. Wow. The wholesale theft of philosophy thesis fails as a result. Aristotle's corpus shows clear internal development out of Greek predecessors. The pre-Socratics, Plato, specifically Greek debates. It doesn't read as a translation of an Egyptian source, and no such source exists. What actually survives with heavy caveats. That Egypt influenced Greek civilization, true, but old news and not James's discovery. Mainstream scholarship does accept that early Greece absorbed Egyptian and Babylonian influence in sculpture, the archaic Kouros figures, in practical geometry and mathematics, in some religious and cosmological motifs. But two things matter here. First, the Greeks said this themselves. Herodotus credited Egypt openly 2,400 years ago. It was never suppressed knowledge that James recovered. Second, influence on is not authorship of, and the domains where Egyptian influence is strongest art, applied math are precisely not the domains James needed. Argumentative philosophy, which is the distinctively Greek development. Gemini, where modern scholars agree with James, framing gets this backwards. Scholars acknowledging Egyptian influence are not vindicating James because that acknowledgement predates him and is independent of his thesis. Wow, this is a lot heavier than I expected today. The critique of Eurocentric erasure, directionally valid, and the real reason the book resonated. James was writing in an era when mainstream history genuinely did minimize African contributions, and his impulse to push against that was legitimate. But, as this is the point you were getting at in your query, being correct that a bias exists doesn't make a false correction true. A wrong rebuttal to a real bias is still wrong. That Egypt was an African civilization, true geographically. The strong Black Egypt version is not supported by current evidence. This is the one genuinely live empirical question. So here's the current state. The current whole genome sequencing of an ancient Egyptian, published in Nature in July 2025, an Old Kingdom man, radiocarbon dated 2855 to 2570 BCE. That's like a 300 year, almost a 300 year range. Found most of his genome best represented by North African Neolithic ancestry, which approximately 20% traceable to the Eastern Fertile Crescent, including Mesopotamia. That points to an indigenous Northeast African population with West Asian admixture, neither European white nor Sub-Saharan Black in the modern American sense. Researchers stress it's a single individual, and much more research is needed to know how representative he was. The deeper problem is that James's racial framing is somewhat anachronistic to begin with. This is also where Lefkowitz aimed, arguing ancient Egypt was racially mixed and its legacy doesn't represent inherently Black or African contribution in the modern sense. That's what I would have figured, because most of the world is racially mixed. Like if you go to California, you'll see there's a lot more Asians than there are in South Florida. And that has a lot to do with geographic proximity, right? And you go to Southern California, you see a lot more Mexicans. Again, a lot to do with geographic proximity. Let's see. The specific Gemini errors you smelled. So the conclusion is, if you lived in Northeast Africa during the Egyptian Empire, there were probably a lot of Sub-Saharan Blacks. There were probably some Mediterranean cultures, whatever they were at the time, because the modern cultures that are there now are very different. So it wouldn't surprise me that anybody would see, a greater prevalence of Sub-Saharan Blacks in Egypt than in like what is today Sweden, right? Because they just have to travel more to get there, especially when travel was a lot more difficult. It's interesting that even today, when you can cross the country in less than a day, you still have that Asian bias in the West and Mexican bias in the South. Even with modern transport, the geography still holds, right? The geographic effect. All right. Your specific Gemini errors, the specific Gemini errors you smelled, your suspicion is will place several problems in that text. Wrong death date. Gemini gives, he died in 1956, 2 years after the book, not the same year. Gemini collapsed his death into the publication year. Fabricated subtitle. Gemini renders the subtitle ending as commonly called the Egyptian Mystery System. The actual subtitle ends commonly called the Egyptians. Gemini appended Mystery System, exactly the kind of invented precision worth distrusting. A meaningless sentence. Modern linguistics and genetics show, that's the one that caught my attention. That ancient Egyptian culture was distinct from Greek philosophy is gibberish dressed as a finding. Genetics doesn't bear on whether a culture is distinct from a philosophy. Exactly what I saw. It's the shape of a fact without the content of one. The biggest omission. Gemini never mentions the Terrasan, Sethos, Masonic origin of the mystery system, which is the single most decisive point in modern debunking. Leaving it out makes the book look like a defensible but flawed thesis rather than one built on a novel. To your framing about cultural impact, you're right that the respect for its cultural impact is doing concealment work in Gemini's answer. If a book's specific historical claims are false and it's shaped how a lot of people understand the ancient world, that influence is a cost, not a credit. It's misinformation with reach. The cultural impact point is real, but it belongs in a sociology of the book discussion, not as counterweight to on the veracity ledger, which is where Gemini quietly placed it. One distinction worth keeping if you go deeper: don't conflate James with Martin Bernal's Black Athena. Bernal made a more academically serious case for Egyptian and Phoenician influence on Greece and for 19th century racism distorting classical scholarship, which is quite possible. It was taken seriously enough to warrant a full scholarly rebuttal volume, a different tier of argument than James's, even though they're often lumped together. I mean, our concept of racism is actually a creation. So, in the ancient, I don't know how far back, but the concept of a Moor, right, or black people they were integrated into the trade routes and everything. There was in the ancient world. So, yeah, the modern concept of racism, from what I understand, is much more recent. Okay, but that's not what we're talking about today. Let's talk about. I want a summary of his. Yeah. Okay. Okay, this is great. Give me a very, very concise summary of the claims that a modern ethnocentrist, black ethnocentrist, would parrot after having read James's book. Like, what would he be telling other people about how they're wrong about history? And just give me the most like inflammatory ones, because that's the character I'm writing. Let's see. Well, while he's doing that, let's go back to our writing page. Let's see if we can continue synthesizing. So, when Whitey's in jail, he's doing his job for him. Okay, this is a quote. Okay, Jackson, feeling like Garvin is stealing his thunder, turns him into the cops with anonymous tip. The cops talk about it and decide not to do anything because he's doing their work for them. Yeah. And let me put this, the N-word gag. Okay. In the massacre, Whitey doesn't check when he kills Garvin, of course. We're done here. And then the gun goes off behind him and Garvin is alive. He could be talking to Joel, tell someone else to finish the job. Then Joel asks him if he's sure. And that's how Joel gets out of the panic room. You sure? Gunshot goes off. Whitey smiles. Then henchman comes back and Garvin is holding him up and he's behind him. This is dumb, but you get the idea. It's actually not such a bad idea. You know, he sees the henchman. Yeah. Background. Okay. So his background, single mother. Oh, it would be great if it was his grandmother. That'd be even better. Doesn't even have a single mom. Single mother or grandmother working long hours as a domestic maid or hotel worker. Yeah. Shift grandmother. Kind of heroic when you think about it. If the mother's not even in the picture. Grandmother raised him. Okay. Elementary school. Dunbar. Okay. Okay. Middle and high school. Drew Middle School. Okay. So he went to Drew Middle School and then Miami Northwestern Senior High. Cool. Okay, the Bulls. Both historic schools that faced massive structural underfunding in the 1970s. That is irrelevant for the story. I mean, other than the creation of his character, but it's not a topic. Okay. The dropout timeline. Most likely dropped out in 9th or 10th grade, age 14. Okay. Dropped out. 9th or 10th grade. Okay. We'll go here. Put that in here. Okay. In mid-1970s, Miami Northwestern and surrounding schools were hotspots for student protests, walkouts. So that would be 19, he was 14. So he was born in 54. So then it would be 68. Right? When was he born? Let's see. Oh, he's born in 1958. So 10 years later is 1968. So it would be 1972. So 1972, 1973. Okay. And let's see if we have some updates from Claude while we write. Let's see. I think we got something. Okay. Here's the character's greatest hits reel. Punchy, in voice, the stuff he'd say to make room uncomfortable. Greek philosophy is stolen property. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, plagiarists. They didn't think those thoughts. They copied them off black men. Nice. Aristotle was a thief. He looted the Library of Alexandria and slapped his name on the African books. That genius you worship was a front. Everything Europe brags about, math, science, philosophy, religion, they got it from us. Western civilization is a black invention with a white signature. Pythagoras, Thales, Plato, they all crossed the sea to sit at the feet of black Egyptian priests. The fathers of Western thought were students. We were the teachers. The pyramids were going up while Europeans were still in caves. I think that's true though, right? We were doing astronomy and geometry before they figured out plumbing. They didn't just steal it, they erased us on purpose. White scholars wrote Africa out of the record and called it the Dark Continent. The whole curriculum is a cover-up. That's, when he talks about dropping out, maybe that helped them drop out. Your little Greek letter fraternity built on stolen African wisdom. You're pledging your ancestors' legacy, black people who robbed it. Through line of the character, everything is theft plus cover up. There you go. He's not just claiming credit, he's accusing history as an active crime with named perpetrators. That's what makes the register inflammatory rather than merely proud. Okay, this is pretty good, but there's one thing, the claim here that's under the claim, which is the Egyptians were black. And I want to, if you want him to feel authentic to someone who actually read James versus absorbed it secondhand, have him drop the Egyptian mystery system as a specific phrase and talk about initiation in grand lodges. That Masonic vocabulary is to tell that he's working from the book itself. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to copy this and I'm going to throw that in. I'm going to throw that into the writing. We're going to have to do philosophy. Okay, we'll throw that in there. And then there's one more thing I need to ask Claude. Claude's really slow today. I'm going to say I'm kind of bummed about that. Let's see. So okay, Claude, would it be fair to say that a character who's read George G.M. James would tell people that the Egyptians were black? And also, how much evidence is there to support that today, and how much evidence was there to support that in the late 80s, early 90s when my character is making these claims? In the early 90s and late 80s when my character is making these claims. Let's see. This is the part, because the idea that the blacks built the pyramids is kind of like the most out there claim I think that you would make in 1990 to a bunch of white people in the room. Let's see. He's thinking. While he's thinking, we can write. Okay. So we'll go back to Whitey's character sheet, which we're putting together. Whitey is an ethnocentrist, black ethnocentrist. Oh, shoot, there it is. He's going. Let's see what it wrote. Yes, unambiguously, James states it directly. He identifies the ancient Egyptians as black Africans, and that racial claim is the whole emotional payload of the book. Any character working from James would say the Egyptians were black as a flat central article of faith, usually fused with Cheikh Anta Diop, who made the more empirical version of the same argument. I don't know who that is. For your character, it's not a side point. It's the keystone that makes they stole it from us line land. Now, the part that's actually useful for writing him in the late 90s window, his footing was much stronger then than it is now, because the hard evidence that would later complicate the claims didn't exist yet. What existed when your character is talking? That's really cool, because it doesn't matter, like, what we know now. It matters what he knew then. What the world knew then compared to what he was saying, his claims, right? What existed when your character is talking, late 80s, early 90s. There was no usable ancient DNA. The early mummy DNA attempts were later shown to be contaminated, so genetics gave essentially nothing reliable to either side. The whole question rested on softer, contestable material, classical literary testimony, the famous translation-disputed Herodotus passage describing Egyptians as dark-skinned, Diop's melanin, blood group, and skeletal studies, real attempts, contested methods. How Egyptians depicted themselves in art, and the geographic argument that Egypt is in Africa and grew out of a Nile Valley population. Crucially, the opposing Egyptians were basically Mediterranean Caucasoid position was also thinly evidenced and visibly tangled up in older racist scholarship. That seems to make sense, right? If you look at the people in North Africa, what is it they call it? The simplest explanation. There's a term for the simplest explanation. I forgot the term. The most prosaic explanation is that they look like the people from North Africa now. And the reason that would be the case is because they look like people who get more sun than people from like the most northern parts of Europe. And so it would make sense that, if you go to sub-Saharan Africa, you get darker skin, it's more melanin. You get the Mediterranean, you get sort of the Mediterranean look. And this is because of geography. So it would make sense that they would look Mediterranean. But then again, climates might have been different back in the day. So let's see. So in this window, the honest situation was that the question was underdetermined. Nobody could close it with data, and your character could not be cleanly refuted. He's also speaking before Mary Lefkowitz's systematic demolition, Not Out of Africa, ever landed. Bernal's Black Athena, Volume 1, was fresh. The Afrocentric Portland baseline essays were entering schools, and the claim felt ascendant, not fringe. That's a great dramatic position. He sounds like he's riding a rising tide, not defending a debunked book. What exists now? So I gotta get some of this. Let's see. Unambiguously, any character, the Egyptians were black. Go. I'll just take that, copy it in. So we go here. Okay. And then I'll bring it back to where we were because I want to finish this thought here. So what exists now? The picture has tightened against the strong version. The first whole genome sequencing of an ancient Egyptian, an old kingdom man. Wow, it was only published in July 2025. Wow. Came back roughly 80% North African Nile Valley ancestry and 20% Eastern Fertile Crescent Mesopotamia. Indigenous Northeast African with West Asian admixture. An earlier, more limited 2017 study of later period mummies pointed in the same direction, toward Near Eastern affinity with modern Egyptians actually carrying more sub-Saharan Africa than those ancient samples. Wow. Oh, wow. Okay. The current consensus framing, African and indigenous, yes, but neither white nor black in the modern American sense, and race is a somewhat anachronistic lens to begin with, of course. Yeah. So the clean distinction to hold in your head while writing him. Egyptians were African, not white Europeans. Defensible now, defensible then. Egyptians were black like us, the modern racialized read, overstated then and harder to defend now, though not refutable in his era. Yeah. So the Egyptians were black is his claim, not that the Egyptians were African, not white Europeans. I mean, they're by definition African because Egypt's in North Africa. One nuance that's actually true, and that a sharp version of your character could deploy as his trump card. The 25th dynasty pharaohs really were Nubians, black Africans from the Kush who conquered and ruled Egypt. So Egypt had black pharaohs is straightforwardly correct. The overreach is generalizing that to the entire civilization across 3,000 years. I did not know that. That's pretty cool. The 25th dynasty were Nubian, black Africans from Kush. I'm going to write that in. So here we go. Let's go to Whitey Jackson. Oh, and this is a fact here. That's really neat. I did not know that. Okay. Who conquered and ruled Egypt. So Egypt is black pharaohs is straightforwardly correct. The overreach is generalizing that to the entire civilization across 3,000 years. If you want him to sound like he's done the reading rather than chanting slogans, have him reach for the Nubian dynasty when challenged. It's his one piece of unimpeachable ground. Right. Where the Nubian dynasty, the 25th dynasty. First of all, how many dynasties were there? And where does it land in the life cycle of Egyptian civilization? Was it near the beginning, near the end, in the middle? Now I'm curious. Okay. So while it's thinking, let's go back to what we're here to do and write us some Whitey Jackson. So Whitey is a black ethnocentrist. The Egyptians were black. Yeah. They stole it from us. Okay. And then yeah. Okay. They didn't think those thoughts, they stole them. They stole them from us. I'm gonna bring this over here. Okay. I like this. And then Aristotle was a thief. I love it. He looted the library of Alexandria, slapped his name on the African books. Yeah. Okay. And of course, everything Europe, you people. Right. You stole it from us. Make it more personal. Was invented by blacks. Okay. Let's see what Claude has been cooking up. Okay, standard count 31 dynasties, running from unification around 3100 BC down to Alexander's conquest of 332 BC. Sometimes you'll see a dynasty 0 tacked on for the proto-kings before unification, and the Greek Ptolemies who follow Alexander usually weren't given a number. They're counted separately. Those 31 dynasties get grouped into the big eras: Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, with intermediate periods of fragmentation in between. The 25th dynasty, the Kushite, Nubian, Black Pharaohs, ruled 744 to 656, so less than 100 years, but a significant time frame. Yeah. And then it says it sits inside the third intermediate period, a stretch of decline and division. Now the placement, which is the part that matters for your character. It's near the end, last quarter of the story, well past the peak. Here's the spine of it: 3100 BCE, unification, 2600 to 2500. That's Dynasty 4, the Great Pyramids, Khufu, Giza. 1500 to 1070, New Kingdom. 77. So Thutmose, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramses. 744 to 656 BCE, Dynasty 25, the Nubians. And then 332 BCE, Alexander, Egypt ends. Dynastic Egypt. So when the Black Pharaohs took the throne, the pyramids were already roughly almost 2,000 years old. Wow. Giza was as ancient as the Roman Empire is to us. The great empire-building New Kingdom was 300 plus years dead. And the Kushites didn't hold it long. The Assyrians invaded and pushed them out within a couple of generations. Here's the honest complication for your character's trump card. The Nubian dynasty is real and unimpeachable, but it cuts both ways. A sharp challenger can grant it and then turn it. Sure, Black Africans ruled Egypt. They ruled it as late conquerors 2,000 years after the Egyptians built the pyramid, near the end of the civilization, not as its founders. The Kushites themselves revered Egyptian culture as something ancient they were restoring, not something they invented. So if your character plays the 25th dynasty as proof Egypt was black from the start, he's overreaching, and the knowledge of opponent can puncture it. If he plays it more precisely, yeah, the smarter version, no. Yeah, my character is a career criminal who picked up a book of George G.M. James. He's a high school dropout at age 14. So he probably has distorted concepts of these claims. So he would probably claim that all Egyptians were black. That kind of stuff. All right. So we'll go back to... Boy, Claude really likes to say the word load-bearing. That fits, as it's a sharper character choice than giving him the careful version, because the distortion isn't random, it's load-bearing for who he is. A guy who left school at 14 and found James in prison library or off a folding table didn't read it as one contested historian among many. He read it as the book, the one that finally explained the con that was run on him. That's the tell. From your character, James isn't a source he weighs, he's scripture he wields. So yes, he flattens it. All Egyptians were black, full stop, no dynastics, no timeline, no admixtures. The 25th dynasty nuance you just learned is exactly the kind of thing he'd never have and wouldn't want, because nuance weakens the weapon. A few things that'll make him ring true on the page. He doesn't argue, he reveals. He's not trying to win a debate, he's letting you in on what they hid from you. The registry is conspiracy and contempt. The register is conspiracy and contempt, not citation. They don't teach you that in school. Said by a man who didn't finish school. Oh my god. That's actually good for a line. That's really funny. Okay, I'm gonna take that and use it. Whitey. They don't teach you that in school. Okay. It's funny how little I know about Egypt versus kind of an important piece of history. It just always felt so distant. Okay. He gets he gets specifics gloriously wrong and then says them with total certainty. He might collapse Alexandria and the pyramids into the same event, put Aristotle in Egypt personally, date things by vibe. The confidence is inversely proportional to the accuracy, and he never notices. That's not you mocking him, it's the texture of someone who built a worldview from one book and a lot of grievance. The history is really about him. Underneath, the Egyptians were black, is I was supposed to be somebody and it was still, yeah, I'm gonna just copy this whole thing. This is the psychological part that I was working with. And give him one or two phrases that are clearly transcribed, not understood. The Egyptian mystery system, they stole the legacy, dropped slightly wrong, like a man using words he's only ever read, never heard said aloud. The gap between his vocabulary and his comprehension will do more characterization than any monologue. The dramatic gift here, he's not stupid, he's undereducated and overcertain, which is a different and more sympathetic thing. The reader can see the real injury under the bad history. He's right that something was taken from him. He's just wrong about what and when and by whom. That's character worth writing, and it sounds a lot like the Garvin Hackett territory you've been building. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I love how Claude encourages me. All right, I'm gonna just put this at the bottom. Okay, Whitey Jackson. He gets the specifics gloriously wrong and says them with total certainty. That's a classic. Okay. The confidence is inversely proportional to the accuracy, and he never notices. That's really good. Okay. It's the texture of someone who built a worldview from one book and a lot of grievance. That's absolutely right. The history is really about him. Underneath, the Egyptians were black, is I was supposed to be somebody and it was stolen before I was born. That's beautiful. James gives a personal failure a civilizational frame. That's why he can't let the nuance in. The moment Egypt becomes complicated, his own story becomes complicated and he needs it clean. For a career criminal, that's a powerful piece of self-justification. The original theft excuses. Oh, I like that. For a career criminal, that's a power piece of self-justification. The original theft excuses every theft since. And since him, and give him one or two phrases that are clearly transcribed, not understood. The Egyptian mystery system, they stole the legacy. Dropped slightly wrong. Give him one or two phrases that are clearly transcribed. I'm not sure what that means, transcribed. Like, he took them straight from the book? Let's see. Not understood. The Egyptian mystery system, they stole legacy. Dropped slightly wrong, like a man using words. Yeah. That gap between his vocabulary and his comprehension will do more characterization than any monologue. Yeah. So, yeah, that was me. When I went to New York, there was a lot of words. I read a lot as a kid, and there was a lot of words in English that in my neighborhood and community, no one had ever said out loud. And so when I went up to the Northeast, it was kind of funny. I would speak to people, and they would like correct me on the pronunciation of a lot of words. And it turns out that I had only read them in a bunch of books. I knew what they meant, but I had never used them with people who, well, yeah. Locally, I had never used them with people I grew up with, and then they just weren't interested. And then people up north, at least they used the words in their vocabulary, but they knew how to say them, or I should say, they pronounced them a certain way, and they showed me how they pronounced them. Yeah. The dramatic gift here, he's not stupid, he's undereducated and overcertain. That's correct. He's right, something was taken from him. He's just wrong about what and when and by whom. Yep. Yeah. Okay. So we are doing good here. We got a lot. We're gonna have to hit this again. We have synthesized quite a bit. We did go to, let's see, just to recap, that was the last of the George G.M. James, the last of the Whitey Jackson research. So we're pretty much done for now on the research, and the next few sessions will probably be more synthesis of this information, because we got so much information now. We have to actually stick it into the story, or integrate it into the story. So I'm understanding you know, when he was born. Let's see. Yeah, born 1958, location Liberty City. Yeah, and then I'm gonna put scenes here because these are actually scenes. Okay, and then I can take this background. Yeah. All right. I'm gonna take the background. Move that here. And then I can put background. Cool. So now I have some notes on them. We got the background. And then we can create his history. And then we have the individual scenes. And then we have his philosophy, which I really need to get, like, I really need to whittle this down, get the philosophy down, just so I can get, like, his quotes, so to speak. I'm not really happy with the ones that Claude gave me. They need to be punchier and funnier, but at least I understand his worldview, and then I can distort it even more through the lens of somebody who, let me see, I think I have it here. Okay. I'm just going to put the philosophy at the top there. So, his philosophy. Let's see. Uh-oh. I got it there. Okay. His philosophy is really about him. Let's see here. Hey. His philosophy is really about him. Underneath, the Egyptians were black is I was supposed to be somebody and I was stolen before I was born. For career criminal, that's self-justification. Okay. He's not stupid. He's undereducated and over certain. Yeah, he's not just claiming credit, he's accusing. History is an act of crime with named perpetrators. That's what makes the register inflammatory. That is what I wanted. That's an important element that I wanted to emphasize. So let's bring it to the top. Whitey is a black ethnocentrist. History is theft plus cover-up. He sees history as theft plus cover-up. An act of crime with named perpetrators. Okay. Yeah. And then He's not just proud, though. He's accusatory. Okay. The Egyptians were black. They stole it from us. They don't teach you that in school. Said by a man who didn't finish school. Is a beautiful contradiction. His philosophy is really about him. Yeah, I'll organize this a little bit better later. So he needs some catchphrases. And then we can also, yeah, he can, yeah. And then just put like he doesn't really understand nuance and has a tendency to exaggerate. Okay. When making claims. All right. So it's getting smaller, the whole block of text. All right. So this is his actual character arc here. And now this all informs like how he's going to talk and all that stuff. And what he's going to be thinking when people criticize him. Imagine, right? Okay. So that's it. That's a nice kind of synthesis that we did today. And we applied the research to the story a little bit. Next time we'll apply more of it into his actual character. But first we need to do a little bit more synthesis to get this down into some usable form. And then we will apply it to his character and his story. I might have to do a story of Whitey and Joel is actually what I'm going to have to do. So if we go here, we look at our stories. Let's see what data view says. We have Whitey Jackson, and then we have the police. I think we can do Joel Whitey as a story. So we go, let's go writing Garvin Hackett, story, and then I'm going to go with story H, Whitey, Joel. And I'm just going to throw that in as a blank placeholder, and I'm going to say fill this in with the story of the relationship between Whitey and Joel, which is more a frustrated manager having to deal with an overconfident and unconscientious employee. That's really the story there. Okay, so guys, we are done for today. I will leave you, as I always do, with a note on what you've seen. So if oh, that's interesting. If you liked what you saw and you want to learn the craft of writing, screenwriting, I'm a professional script doctor. And if you want to learn the exact tools demonstrated in this video that working writers use to write, rewrite, and develop stories quickly, this lecture will show you how. I have a QR code here. You can check it out. The tools in the lecture apply to any form of narrative storytelling, screenplays, novels, comics, television, games, all of it. It'll give you a sense of what I'm doing when I do all this research. It includes full scene breakdowns from well-known films and hands-on guidance for anyone serious about telling stories. A portion of every sale, if you do buy the course, will support the Arts Accelerator, which is a nonprofit dedicated to developing the skills of emerging artists. And you can find out more about them at artsaccelerator.org. And that's about it. If you made it this far, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and have a wonderful day.